All right, let's continue with our presentation video lecture on chapter 8 with the Islamic Empire. Now we're looking at expansion. And we see that the size of the Abbasid dynasty or the Arab Empire, the Caliphate of the Abbasids, was huge, right? We see it here in this map. So it was much larger than the Roman Empire, which would have been around the Mediterranean here. This is much, 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 much larger, right? So they went out from North Africa all the way into India, right? The Indus Valley over here, into Central Asia, into Anatolia, right? Modern day Turkey, all of Arabia, Persia, and so on. So basically, we see that through conquest, the Arab Empire expands, gets bigger, 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 bigger. So what happens is just like other empires, it gets too big. It gets way too big to manage correctly. So the government attempted to try to fix these problems, but weren't really all that successful. And basically, as the empire gets bigger, then the territories furthest away, uh, furthest away from the centralized, bureaucracy in Baghdad, they're going to slowly and start inserting their own independence and running things by local rulers instead of some unknown caliph thousands of miles away. Again, the bigger they get, the less likely, the less centralized they got. As independent lords might want to kind of just declare themselves as independent, and free from the rule of the caliph or the emperor. The Abbasids also, we see that they, like any other rulers, they grew corrupt and they started, pocketing all the money and not investing government funding into, infrastructure and stuff like that. And as a result, when people didn't like that, so we see a lot of rebellions um, rise up against the authority. And even further down the line, we see that the caliphs stop being the political leader. They kind of become more symbolic. Think of like kind of like Queen Elizabeth of England. She's kind of like simply the symbolic leader of Great Britain, but she's not really, doesn't have any political power. So the same thing kind of happens with the caliphs. They're just gonna stick around and they're the royal family and they have all this wealth, and they spend their whole time just kind of like wasting away their money. But then other individuals called viziers or prime ministers, they kind of become the main people in charge. And again, this leads to this kind of like slow decline. At the same time that all this is happening, we see a series of invasions um, take place in the Abbasid Empire. So, for example, we see these kind of large migrations of people coming into the Abbasid territories. The first of the group of these people were called Mamluks, and Mamluks were Turkic people. Right, they came from Central Asia. They were Turks, and originally they came in as slaves, right, and they were forced to work in the military. But over time, they decided to convert to Islam. And of course, according to Muslim law, you can't have Muslims as slaves. So they said, "Hey, look, we used to be slaves, but now we're Muslims, so you gotta give us our freedom." And the government said, "No, you still have to serve us, and you still have to fight for us. And there's nothing that you can do about it." So then they rebelled, and then they created their own kingdom, which was centered in Cairo, in Egypt, and they kind of had their own caliphate, and they kind of just separated, broke away from the Abbasid Empire. Then another group, they're not so much as invaders, more like migrants, and these would be the Seljuk Turks. And they also come in and they kind of start integrating and mixing in with the Arabs and the other Muslims, and little by little they kind of slowly start rising in ranks in the government and the military, and little by little they decide that their leader, the Sultan, should be in charge. So we see that the Caliph, who had become kind of the symbolic leader, eventually gets replaced by the Sultan. And one thing you're going to notice whenever we talk about the Sultans is that they're always going to have these big, fancy, kind of weird looking headdresses. And the Seljuk Turks, they're going to be part of the reasons we see with the the decline of Byzantium or the Byzantine Empire, because they're always going to be fighting with them. On top of that, around the 1100s, 1200s, we see the Crusades take place, right, where the European Christians are coming in to fight for the city of Jerusalem, what they call the Holy Land, in hopes of freeing Jerusalem from the control of the Seljuk Turks or Muslims. And this is kind of like over 100 years of battles, and it's back and forth. And basically, even though it doesn't have like this devastating effect on the Abbasid Empire, it weakens them, and they lose some territory for some time. But it's just one additional issue that the Abbasids had to deal with. But the end and final kind of like nail in the coffin for the Abbasid Caliphate is the Mongols, right? Which we'll talk about in the chapter. But the Mongols come in. They're also from Central Asia, and they go straight to Baghdad, and they completely destroy the city of Baghdad, and kill the caliph, kill the sultan, kill everyone who was in charge, and the kind of like put an end to the Abbasid dynasty. All right. We also have other economic issues that kind of led to these weakening and decline. We see that Baghdad, the actual city itself, before the Mongols came and destroyed it, was already on the decline, because we see that trade shifts were changing. So instead of trading through Baghdad, new trade routes were being opened up that traded away from Baghdad, which means that not that many merchants are going to go through Baghdad anymore, and therefore they're going to lose their kind of like upper, wealthy status. Um, we also see as the empire slowly starts breaking apart and the regions are separating from the capitals or the center of the empire, we see that there's going to be less production, which means less stuff being made, less stuff to export, less trade, and of course because they had such a huge empire with this humongous military, they of course had to get paid. We see that they spend so much of their money on defense, and in the end, all of this just led to their weakening and to their decline. But before they declined, we see that they had these great achievements. The Abbasids is considered the golden age of the Islamic Empire. So, for example, one of the things that they invent is a pump to pump out water from the ground, right? Absolutely necessary for irrigation, especially out in the hot, dry desert climates. The Muslims are they invent the science of chemistry, right? Understanding the molecular structure of everything, which also includes perfumes, right? They're the first ones to use or kind of study or how to make perfumes. Astronomy, they measure, they kind of figure out how the Earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around, which is what the Greeks had thought. And they kind of made a rough estimation of how big the Earth is, the circumference of the Earth, long before Columbus set sail. And they also made great achievements in anatomy. They studied medicine, they understood how the body worked, and in fact, they wrote textbooks, medical textbooks, that became kind of like the standard textbook in Europe for hundreds of years. So again, this is the golden age, right? They also studied the Greeks and the Romans, especially Aristotle. They loved Aristotle. So they took everything that the Greeks and the Romans had and they wrote it down, and therefore they preserved it. And then they taught it to other people, including the Europeans. So the Europeans kind of like relearned about their own history from Greece and Rome, thanks to the Muslims, thanks to the Arabs. Algebra, right? Even though the Greeks had it before, the Arabs really kind of establish it as a major mathematical field. And in fact, the name algebra is an Arabic word. They also remember they're the ones who introduced the Indian numeric system to the Europeans. That's what they call the Arabic numerals. Paper, right? The Chinese invented, the Muslims learned it, they adopted, they improved it. And that had a whole bunch of universities. Probably the most important ones were Baghdad and Cordoba, right? The most famous, largest universities. So again, chemistry was a big invention of theirs. There was also literature is very important, especially Persian literature. One of the most famous books is the one called the Book of 1001 Nights or Arabian Nights. So that's where we see like the famous, Open Sesame Alibaba story. We also see, of course, Aladdin as one of those stories. Now, when it comes to artwork, the main thing we need to know about the artwork is that under Islamic law, you cannot depict, you cannot show, you cannot display images of Muhammad or any other religious leader in Islam. And this kind of like goes against what the Arabs before Islam used to do, which is that they used to pray to little statues and little idols and stuff like that. But Muhammad had banned this practice. So and just kind of like how the Byzantines had banned the practice for a while, that they also had that iconoclasm where they were banning the use of these images. So they focus on geometric patterns. These are called astrolabes, right? These kind of like circles and drawings and patterns repeated over and over. So idolatry, right? Praying to idols or false idols or praying to images, right? This is banned in Islam, and they take it very serious. Even to this day, there's a lot of conflicts between people trying to show images of Muhammad and Muslims getting offended by it. All right, let's move on to social classes. All right, so the first thing we're going to know is that, at least according to Islam, everyone's supposed to be equal, including people of the book. So Muslims, Jews, and Christians are all supposed to be equal under the law. And I say supposed to because, of course, in practice, that's never really the case. Um, One requirement, of course, for non-Muslims living within the Arab Empire, the Caliphate, is that they have to pay a special tax, right? Which is something we saw the Persians and the Romans and the Hellenistic empires, right? All these empires before them, they all had this already. So the Islamic Empire, adopted this practice. They had a special tax called the Jaza tax, and they had to pay, to be able to practice freely. Um, Another thing we actually should know when it comes to the inequality is that there was always this favoritism towards Arab Muslims above all else. So Arab Muslims were always given a kind of like these high ranking, high status positions in the government or in the military, while other Muslims who may not have been Arabs, like Persians, they were never, kind of given equal access, equal opportunity as well. Also, we need to mention merchants, right? Because merchants are going to be very different in Islamic society than other places. For one thing, merchants are actually viewed as professional and prestigious and honorable, which is different than China, which, thanks to Confucianism, they're always going to view merchants as kind of like these low class, greedy, horrible people. And in the Byzantine and Europe, they're going to view merchants as greedy as well, so they're not going to have that high of a status. But in Islam, merchants are viewed positively because, of course, Muhammad himself was a merchant. He was a caravan manager on the desert trade routes in Arabia. So in Islam, we see kind of a weird shift in that merchants are actually valued and respected. And above all else, they're also respected because merchants are responsible for spreading religion, right? Because these merchants are going to travel long distances, whether it's across the Silk Road, across the Sahara Desert, which is a new trade network called the Trans-Sahara, or they're going to be sailing across the Indian Ocean. And the end result is that where these merchants go and they settle down and start trading, they're going to bring Islam with them, and therefore they're going to be viewed as very important people. All right, so we're going to stop here for this next part of our video. See you next time.